Organizational change is a required constant in our ever-changing world. Yet any kind of change process involves numerous intersections of power. Being aware of these intersections and knowing how to navigate them well are key leadership competencies. In this session, I'll share some of my research on a church that went through a year-long direction-setting process. I was a pastor at the church at the time. Based on my own observations and interviews with 20 people who participated in the direction-setting process, I noticed several types of power that surfaced. The power of privilege, discursive practices, or simply put, the way we use words, outspokenness, trust, shared perspectives, symbols, transparency, pain, and intimidation. I'll explore these in greater detail and suggest how leaders might navigate these kinds of power intersections in a way that is most beneficial for organizational members and the organizations they serve. Well, we all know that direction setting is a common practice in North American organizations. Organizational leaders often unquestioningly accept traditional direction setting strategies as best practices. Some organizations have incorporated more participatory approaches to direction setting in an attempt to build the organization on the values and passions of its members, or at least to foster ownership of predetermined values through a process of joint decision-making. Yet how does power influence direction-setting processes and the directional knowledge, that is, the strategic plans, that those processes seek to generate? What happens to a direction-setting process when people group together around a shared perspective about the future shape of the organization? How does this sharing of perspectives intersect with power and knowledge? The outcome of most direction-setting processes is some sort of direction plan that often includes a mission statement, preferred core values, and a statement of vision, along with some strategic priorities. What factors influence the formulation of these kinds of direction plans? What effect might the degree of representation, that is, the degree to which people have been involved meaningfully in the process, have on the motivational levels of those asked to give themselves to the execution of the plan? These are critical questions because they draw attention to potential problems with typical direction-setting processes, even those that claim to be highly collaborative in nature. As an attempt to begin answering these questions, I'll describe one particular direction-setting process in a church I'll simply call Crossroads. I'll also look at two sets of theoretical lenses that are helpful for understanding direction-setting processes and review some of the lessons I learned about navigating some of the power intersections that leaders may encounter in an organizational change process. I had the privilege of serving as a pastor at Crossroads Church for 16 years. Toward the end of my time at the church went through an intensive year-long direction-setting process. 5 years later, when I was no longer a pastor at the church, I conducted an ethnographic case study where, as I mentioned already, I interviewed a number of participants to get a broader and deeper understanding of what happened during that year. I was particularly interested in how power intersected with the process. As a leader who was vitally involved in the process and who desired to become a more effective leader in the future, I wanted to discern how we used and mediated the use of power well, and when our power usages were less effective or even inappropriate. Crossroads' refocusing process was preceded by a crisis that shook the church to its very core. Unbeknownst to the lead pastor, the church elders decided to evaluate his leadership by talking with others in the church. After completing their covert evaluation, they presented the lead pastor with a letter outlining their concerns. To add insult to injury, they gave him the letter just a few weeks after the death of one of his parents. The lead pastor, believing that he had lost the confidence of his leadership team, quickly resigned. As a result, the church went into a tailspin, as many congregants were confused, angry, and sad over the loss of a beloved pastor. The church board recognized that they needed help to pull the church back from the brink and to discern God's direction for the future. We met with a consultant, whom I'll call Ray, who had led many churches through a direction-setting process called refocusing. After sensing that Ray was the right person with the right process for Crossroads, the board recommended to the congregation that we proceed with hiring Ray to help us. The majority of the congregation supported the board's recommendation, and so we hired Ray to lead us through a pivotal phase in the life of the church. The refocusing process had two major components: personal refocusing and corporate refocusing. Personal refocusing featured a weekend retreat where individuals would identify their best sense of God's calling on their lives. The corporate refocusing included leaders and those who had contributed significantly to the church. These leaders participated in 3 weekend summits to assess the church's history and to see both positive and negative patterns that contributed to the church's present. They also met to identify both current and desired core values, and then to discern God's vision for the future. The final summit was about identifying strategic priorities for realizing that vision. One of Ray's first priorities was to form a 7-member refocusing team that would take the lead in facilitating the refocusing process. The church board developed a list of preferred candidates for the team. Even during this process, it was evident that there were differences of opinion amongst board members. Those with more progressive leanings wanted younger, more progressive people on the refocusing team, while the traditionalists on the board, those who were content with how things were, wanted those of like mind on the team. The progressives outnumbered the traditionalists on the board, so it wasn't surprising that the refocusing team reflected a more progressive outlook. The first part of the refocusing process was personal in nature. Approximately 100 people from the church went through a 10-hour process to articulate their sense of personal calling, comprised of a biblical purpose, core values, and vision. The second part of the process, which only those who had participated in personal refocusing could attend, featured those 3 weekend summits I mentioned, where attendees worked on a direction plan for the church. The assumption was that those who had a clear sense of their own calling would be in a good position to help articulate the church's purpose, core values, and vision. It's important to realize that the board developed an invitation list comprised of church influencers that guided who was approached to participate in both personal and corporate refocusing. I should add that the corporate refocusing did not go as smoothly as we had originally planned. As we got closer to the 2nd weekend summit, it became clear that the church could not move forward because of the tension and division between people. Ray and I called an audible and changed the focus of the 2nd summit from discerning vision to reconciliation and healing. On the Friday evening, Ray called the 70 or so leaders to account for the dysfunction and sin he had observed amongst us. He challenged us to go off by ourselves and read Romans chapters 12 to 15, and then to come back and share publicly what God was saying to us. What ensued was a powerful time of repentance and reconciliation. The next day, the board, which had become increasingly fractured and dysfunctional, met to work through their differences and to create a board covenant that would help them function in a more unified, transparent way. On Sunday, I was scheduled to preach. Well, I scrapped my sermon plans and led the entire church through a similar process of repentance and reconciliation, the same kind of process that the leaders had experienced on Friday night. That weekend marked the start of a turning point for the church as we began to deal with sin, dysfunction, and broken relationships. Now, in addition to the weekend summits, anyone in the church could give feedback on the summit summaries by participating in discussion groups called pulse groups. So, in theory at least, everyone had a chance to get their fingerprints on the emerging direction plan. Yet as I looked back at those who actually attended personal refocusing, the corporate refocusing summits, and the pulse groups, it would seem that a whole subgroup of the church was largely missing. Those with more traditional views of the church apparently opted out of the process either physically by not attending or by simply not participating in the pulse groups they did attend. Something was keeping this group back from adding their voice to the emerging directional knowledge and strategic plans. The final products of the process were a ministry direction plan which had a decidedly progressive bent, and a pastoral profile that described the kind of lead pastor we thought could help us achieve this plan. The congregation endorsed the plan, but later, a small minority would undermine the hiring of the first lead pastor candidate that the board put forward as someone who could lead the church according to the ministry direction plan. The candidate, who happened to be me, needed an 85% affirmative vote at a congregational meeting. Several months later, we discovered that one member who was opposed to me becoming lead pastor rallied several inactive members to come out to the meeting to vote against me. I received an 83.6% affirmation vote. Ouch. Even though the traditionalist perspective did not register in a significant way during the refocusing process itself, the traditionalists apparently were able to muster enough support to thwart the implementation of the plan, at least for a while. Now, of course, God's ultimate plans are not to be easily thwarted. Within a few years, Crossroads hired a new lead pastor that, in many ways, was more progressive than me. In this story, I've presented a timeline that shows the major events of Crossroads' refocusing process. Yet much more was happening beneath the surface. Several key observations and questions emerge about how people's use of power influenced the process. First, how were people responding to their own articulation of a personal calling they believed was from God? How was their own sense of personal calling influencing their thinking about the church's calling? To what extent did Ray, the refocusing facilitator, influence the process and its eventual outcomes? Did the use of language push people in certain directions? How did people respond to terms like refocusing, personal calling, surrender, sin, and the elephant of pride, which were used during the process? How did the choice of some scriptures and the exclusion of others influence things? It's also instructive to explore how the refocusing curriculum, with its templates and examples, influence people's thinking. How did the format of discussion activities influence the process? It was also apparent that summit discussions often led people toward an apparent consensus. Was the process of consensus building an act of power? Ray and I used a template from another church to help craft Crossroads' vision statement. Was this an act of power that influenced the final vision product? If so, was that a good or bad use of power? From my vantage point as an insider in the refocusing process, I saw many intersections of power with the formulation of the final ministry direction plan. For instance, Ray appointed me to the refocusing team. He crafted the summit summaries. He led the way in changing the focus of the second summit with my strong endorsement. He selected a ministry model which eventually made it into the finalized ministry direction plan. How did Ray's actions influence the writing of the refocusing story? Yet Ray was not alone in exercising power during Crossroads' refocusing process. The board was primarily responsible for selecting the refocusing team and approving a leadership invitation list. How did their actions influence the course of refocusing? As the refocusing process progressed, it became increasingly apparent that some of the people coalesced around perspectives related to change. How did the opposing perspective-based groups exercise power during refocusing? What were the cultural values unique to each perspective-based group that gave rise to the clash between perspectives? During refocusing, worship style seemed to surface as a flashpoint for the collision of values. It was almost as if worship style became a symbol of what the church was becoming, much to the chagrin of those who wanted the church to remain the same. So how did the opposing groups exercise power in the worship style debate during refocusing? As I already mentioned, the second summit featured an attempt to bridge the perspective divide. People publicly confessed their sins. Reconciliation seemed to happen as individuals who had been at odds with one another sought to make things right. How did this exercise of power influence the perspective-based groupings and their relationship with each other? How did what happened during the second summit contribute to the exercise of power by these perspective-based groupings after the summit? I also observed that power influenced participation during refocusing. How did personally inviting a select group of people influence involvement in the refocusing process? Furthermore, attending the personal refocusing sessions was a requirement for participating in the corporate refocusing summits. How did this arrangement influence participation in refocusing as a whole? I'm also intrigued by the fact that some of the groups where discussions about refocusing took place, for example, pre-refocusing information meetings and congregational meetings, were numerically large. How did group size affect the degree to which people contributed to the discussions? How did the practice of publicly voting at some of these meetings influence the integrity of people's participation? Did some people abandon their personal values to go along with the emerging majority position? Did this naturally happen during times of consensus building? How might this have affected people's commitment to the directional knowledge that did not reflect their personal values to a large degree? Finally, at the congregational meetings, church members usually endorsed board recommendations. Did the culture of congregational meetings minimize authentic participation by discouraging the expression of viewpoints contrary to that of the boards? Was there a force at these gatherings that influenced participation? If some felt intimidated to speak out during congregational meetings, did others feel intimidated during other parts of the refocusing process? The stated intention of the pulse groups was to sharpen the summit summaries. Did this intention and associated initiatives as acts of power relegate pulse group participation to the realm of fine-tuning? As you can see, there is much to explore, something I do in an in-depth way in my book, Navigating Church Politics. However, over the next 4 sessions, I'll begin to answer some of these questions as I take a closer look at some theoretical lenses that can help us understand how power influences change processes. And with these lenses in place, we'll be in a better position to identify the types of power that influence Crossroads' direction-setting process, and how these and others might influence your organization as you seek to lead change.